welcome back everyone after that exciting kickoff to this conference. We're very excited more excited now to bring you actual findings from evaluating the livelihoods mission. We're going to have two evaluations. There's lots of people on this panel, but do not panic. There's not going to be like 17 presentations. There's only two. But we wanted to make sure that everyone who's been involved in the presentation at least is able to come in and speak to some part of it, so that you sort of see how much of a large and broad-based team effort this was. What you're going to hear today are two presentations from two different evaluations that were commissioned by the Ministry of Rural Development. So we heard this morning about the challenges of evaluating government programs, the challenges of having policymakers, having the policymakers respond to findings, use those findings, how do you shape them and massage what we sort of do with 1,000 regressions, how do you massage that into key messages that then policymakers can use to actually act on. And so we're very excited, and I think it's a real privilege that we have had MORD completely on board with these evaluations. I mean, it's evaluations that they commission, but in terms of sense making and looking through, I think several different presentations and understanding how to interpret what we're seeing, sharing what their questions are, what they're curious to understand. It's been a real pleasure in sort of trying to work with the ministry to understand and make sense of these findings and present them in ways that would be most useful to the ministry. So the way this panel is structured is we'll first have the most recent findings that have come out of the evaluation of the World Bank support to NRLM, and I think these two are pretty, they mean the same thing to most of us. As the World Bank has been very key partners with the MORD in designing and implementing the National Livelihoods Mission. And that presentation is going to be about 45 minutes long. And again, I don't want to introduce every single speaker because it will take up the time of the entire panel. But we have with us, this particular team is led by Anjini Kochar from Stanford Center for International Development, who's sitting right next to me. Next to her is Bidisha Barooah from 3IE. Next to her is Rohan Shah from Vrutti. And we also have in the audience Sharmishta from Nielsen over there, who were all of them partnered to sort of carry out this evaluation. And there are many other people here from the 3IE team, from the Vrutti team, and Stanford, who have all been participating and sort of making sure that you have rich findings to sort of listen to today. So this presentation will go first, and then the second presentation will be another evaluation that came out about a year prior to this. And the team that will be presenting those findings will be Abhishek Gupta from the World Bank, who's next to Rohan, Vivek Pandey from IRMA, and Shivani Gupta from IFPRI. We also have with us, the two people who were sort of key to designing and managing and sort of overseeing not just these evaluations, but also the programs themselves. So Ms. Neeta Kejriwal, who's Joint Secretary of the Ministry of Rural Development, will serve as discussant. And after her will be Gayatri Acharya from the World Bank, who will also, as one of the investors in this program, speak to sort of react to the findings that they're going to hear. So with that, let me hand this over to the first team, and Anjini, Bidisha, and Rohan will present their findings.
I want to start with a quick note of thanks. You never know how long the presentations are going to go, so it's always good to get your thanks over at the beginning rather than the end. Sincere thanks to Nielsen for being a great partner with us in this endeavor. And then I want to thank Neeta Kejriwal and MORD more generally, Gayatri from the World Bank, and Yamini. I think it's no surprise that since we're talking about women's and women's empowerment, we have a really tremendous group of women who have come together in this project. The project would not have happened without all their support. Yamini and Gates Foundation has allowed us the freedom to do the research on this and allowed us to extend that research, and I'm going to be talking about how much that means to us. Gayatri was able to take a risk. We put in place a very different evaluation strategy, and I remember meeting her 2 years ago, and she said, I sense you're not comfortable with the old study and the old methodology, so please go ahead and do whatever you like. Without that confidence in us, I don't think we would be here talking about the results we have. And then, of course, the Ministry of Rural Development, and Neeta in particular, they have pushed us to, they've asked us questions and pushed us for answers. And I hope you'll see that reflected in the research, that we're able to do so much more and hopefully make this something that is going to be really important and effective for policy. And if it is, I think the credit really goes to the Ministry of Rural Development for how proactive they have been in this whole program. This evaluation is of the National Rural Livelihoods Program. I'm going to talk about it in very, very general terms. Abhishek is going to give a little bit more detail about it, and that allows me to be much more general about the whole thing. Just in terms of this presentation, I am going to be very general and very broad and talk about the methodology and the way we thought of this study. And then the results itself will be presented by my colleagues, Bidisha and Rohan. Okay, so my approaches, as I said, are very much on the general side. I'd start by saying that NRLP is an incredible program. It is innovative. It is really in the frontier of what is going on in self-help groups. And so it has been a real privilege to immerse myself in NRLP for the past 2 years, and I think I speak for the whole evaluation team that is sitting over here and engaged in this. Okay, what makes NRLP so different? First point is it addresses the failures of earlier livelihood programs. So NRLP follows SGSY. SGSY was a program that focused just on self-help groups and bringing together self-help groups. That program, after its 10-year period, was evaluated by the Radhakrishna Committee report. And that committee report suggested, here are all these things that went wrong. NRLP then took all those messages and really acted on them. So earlier we had these questions about where has there been research and where has research translated into policy. I think it speaks a lot about the ministry that they are the ones who have taken the lead in this. Okay, what did the Radhakrishna Committee report say? It said that SGSY had not been a success. And it said the main reasons that it has not been a success is this statement that I love, and I love to quote. It says that institutions of the poor are nothing but poor institutions. Okay, if you take 10 poor people and put them in a group, this could be a question I could ask you in a Econ 101 exam. So what happens when you take 10 people and put them in a group? The answer is you get 10 poor people. Okay, and that is, I think, what the Radhakrishna Committee report was saying. Okay, what do you do about that? You have to then work further. Okay, you have to integrate them into markets. You have to connect them in some way. You have to have these networks that go out and scale up the program in different ways. But if you scale up, so if you start with just small self-help groups across India and then you try to scale up, you have to confront the problems of scale. Okay? So what happens when I now spread over every village in India? I have a resource constraint. I have to make sure there are resources. And I have a human capital constraint. I have to make sure that I have enough good people who are managing these, overseeing these, providing that kind of support. Okay? NRLP, I think, is unique because it is a program that works at scale, but in working at scale, it designed and put into place a set of mechanisms to address the constraints that come with scale. Okay? Many different ways in which they did this, but I'm going to give you one example. It's what is called as communitization in NRLP. When they start, they recruit members of the community, and then they work to give training to all these members of the community. So then the community members itself can then go on and extend NRLP. Okay? In the documentation for NRLP, these are referred to as the external drivers. These are local community cadre people who are external in that sense. They drive NRLP geographically, so they help it spread across to many more different self-help groups. And then there are the internal cadres, and these internal drivers are the ones who are used for strengthening NRLP vertically. You start with a self-help group, you give them access to funds, you give them more resources, you give them training, so those are all the internal drivers. Where do we get the people to drive NRLP both externally and internally? We get them from the community because they have put in place this set of things to address constraints. They also put into place a set of mechanisms to ensure convergence with government programs. Okay, so I want a self-help group to work with the Gram Panchayat It's not going to happen automatically. You have to think of institutional arrangements that will make that happen, and NRLP actually puts into place all those institutional mechanisms to ensure convergence. There's a strong link of what NRLP is doing to economic theory, and I'm going to take a brief second, or not second, several minutes, to talk about these economic theories, both because they help us raise questions, but they also help us interpret the results we're going to get. Okay, so the starting point of much of this literature is the fact that when there are market constraints, small groups, homogeneous groups drawn of people of the same community, same social norms, can help overcome those constraints because you can use social norms to ensure that there's no default in this. Okay, and that was really the starting point of Grameen and SGSY before that. A second literature then goes on to say, actually, if you do this, if you take a program by which, or if you take an approach which focuses on social norms and community groups, you're going to have persistent poverty and increased inequality. Okay, why does that happen? Suppose I'm in a group with 9 other people who I know very well and whose social approval I crave. I'm not going to do anything to risk that. Okay, so the risk of defaulting here is very, very large, as a result of which I'm not going to borrow. I'm basically going to go into inaction to make sure that I'm not thrown out of that group. Okay? And that is a second way in which if you think normally that these groups are going to be successful, there's actually literature which says that they're not going to be successful. How will they work? The only people who will get loans are people who actually are already wealthy, members of the group. And so you might see an increase in inequality as a result of that social action. How do you break out of that? Well, you break out of that by increasing the returns, and so people aren't so afraid of social of action because the returns are so high. And that is normally going to come by linking SAGs to markets. So the whole movement actually in NRLP is this movement of we start with self-help groups, but we have to ensure that there's a return to that self-help group. How are we going to get that? We're going to get that by linking self-help groups to markets and ensuring that they succeed in that way. Okay? But when you link to markets, you are going to have this issue that any market mechanism is going to benefit if their scale, and so you have to ensure scale, and that again gets us back to NRLP. What are you going to do and how are you going to ensure scale? Okay, NRLP, as I said, did it through federations. And a final literature, well, 2 other final literatures on this. If I federate, say at the village organization level, the VO level, federation actually has 2 purposes. Okay, federation can help me connect to markets and ensure market returns, but federation can also serve as a delegated monitor. And so this is, again, the financial intermediation literature, that by forming a VO, the VO can serve not just to provide access to markets, but can serve to monitor the self-help group. Okay? The question then arises, if a VO can monitor the self-help group and ensure default, do we really need small homogeneous groups of everyone drawn from the same hamlet? Why can't I go to a more diverse group in which there'll be more learning and spillovers? Okay, so what about group membership and how does that change? And what is the role of group membership in this? What is the role of VOs in supporting different kinds of groups and groups that can form? The last question on the theoretical side, which I think is important, is a dynamic question. Okay, so we formed a group of people who are, say, 40 years old, 45 years old. I think 40 is the median age. 10 years later, that group is now 55 years old, okay, or 50 years old. Do they have the same need to borrow and to lend? And if they don't, are they going to exit the group? And the group is going to fall apart. Okay, so we have a case in Madhya Pradesh where there's a very high rate of dysfunctional self-help groups and groups that are defunct. Should we see that as a failure, or should we see that as a success? Okay, that members have actually graduated and don't feel any need for a self-help group. Okay? The answer to that question actually may be in a completely different way. I would call it a failure if that group is actually dysfunctional, and it continues to collect money even though it's not working. I would call it a success if the group has failed, it's gone out, but the funds that should have gone to that group go to support new groups of younger people and allows the system to grow dynamically. Okay? So are those the questions that we are answering? Those are the questions that we are posing. To get to our study, it's a large study. I'm going to come back to this over and over again. It covers 9 states and a sample of about 27,000 households. The unique nature of NRLP and the complexity of the system, for me at least, means that it is ill-suited to a traditional impact evaluation. Okay, so a traditional impact evaluation, or actually any kind of impact evaluation, the study design, the survey design, determines the questions you can ask and the questions you can answer. Okay? The traditional survey design for impact evaluations now is a randomized control trial, or otherwise a difference in difference, which uses a baseline and an endline survey. Okay? Once you have that, the question you can answer is very simple. You can answer, has this program been effective? Has it had an impact? Okay? You can't really go beyond that. And I'm going to give you RCTs and diff as an example. Okay, a randomized control trial requires you to select treatment and control samples before the project starts. Okay. What does that mean for NRLP? It means that I've selected my treatment and control samples before a self-help group was formed. Okay. I can't then connect individuals to self-help groups. Okay, what is the essence of NRLP? Why does NRLP differ from SGSY and from IRDP, which came before SGSY? It differs because we formed groups, and then we networked those groups into village organizations, or we federated them into village organizations. Yet, if you look at the fairly large literature which evaluates self-help groups in the NRLP family, I can't think of any of them which has actually linked households to self-help groups, and which have therefore answered the question, what is the characteristic of the group that has an impact? Okay? How do you answer that question? I think you go to something different. You go to what Professor Heckman calls econometric policy evaluation. You start from the policy, and you say, what are the essential features of this policy that I want to learn about? And in NRLP, it would be, I want to learn about groups, and I want to learn about federation. And that is going to lead to a completely different design from what you would have done otherwise. The design, I'll talk about what we do and how the design is different. Okay, the other part of the traditional approach, the impact evaluation approach, is it bundles the effects of all the programs, the interventions that have come in NRLP. Okay, so I'm going to give you a result from our study. The first set of regressions we ran just on the diff and diff, which I'll talk about later, showed 0 impact of the program. So I could then go to Ms. Kejriwal and tell her, I'm sorry, the program had no impact. But when we probed further, the reason the program had no impact, at least in this initial analysis, is because the program was incredibly successful in scaling up. Okay? You're going to these small, late villages, you're building capacity. That's typically the control group, the people that came at the end. But you build up capacity so well that that control group does very, very well. And it does as well as the early starters. Okay? So if I compare early starters and late starters, there's no impact. But the reason there's no impact is because the program was so successful. Okay? If you can't disentangle that, you're left with this answer that the program had limited impact when you really needed to push forward in that. Okay? The example I gave is one of bundling, but of bundling of scale. But there are many other things that are bundled in that initial thing. Okay, think of the VO effect. Okay, how does an RCT handle the fact that there are multiple interventions? It would have different treatment arms. Okay, so you have one treatment arm, you choose one set of samples that is going to evaluate one thing, something else that evaluates that. How do you do a different treatment arm for village organizations, for a federation? The success of the federation depends on how successful the lower level, the self-help groups are. So if I randomly assign some self-help groups to a VO and some not, I'm undermining the whole system, and nothing is going to be effective. I've really interfered in the policy design, which means that a traditional RCT can't do anything but evaluate the program as a whole. It can't get into questions related to groups and related to federations. Programs that operate at scale, and by scale I'm talking about NRLP, the fact that different levels depend on the success of the bottom level, the fact that they all have to work together, the fact that treatment spills over to control and affects the returns to control. These are what scale programs are, and they require a different kind of evaluation. So what did we do, or how is our study designed? There is no baseline study. Okay? There's a huge advantage of that. The advantage is we could start with self-help groups that already existed because we're literally coming in at the end line. So starting with self-help groups, we can then go back to members. And so our study, I think, will be one of the few that starts with the self-help group and gives you evidence on the role of the self-help group in the success of the program. We didn't have RCT, we didn't have a baseline and end line. So how do we then evaluate it? We evaluated it by building in a very purposive survey design. Okay? We took the phasing of the program very seriously. The phasing was across blocks. That part was simple. We have early blocks and late blocks which are determined by the ministry. And then below that, there's a phasing in villages. You have a project team that starts in a cluster, starts with early villages and goes down to late villages, and that takes a period of about 4 years. Okay, so we use that and we identify that, use this phasing within villages. I'll talk about how it is done. Okay, but building up that design meant that we had to work with MIS data. We had to know which were the early villages and we had to know which were the late villages. So here's an example when we have taken MIS very, very seriously, and it has really provided us with the backbone for everything that we have done. Without that, it would not have been possible. We used the MIS, we used the census. We had all the challenges of merging across MIS and census. So of course, we all know that the blocks, if you're a revenue block versus a CD block, those are different things. And so you could have the same block census ID, but they're completely different blocks. We didn't know, we learned this as well, that the census village code is not unique. There's a village in Jharkhand with the same census code, which is in West Singhbhaum, and then there's a similar village, same census code in Ranchi. All these problems that had to be worked through and that we did. But in the end, we have a survey which allows us to do this. We built an intensive data collection. We use a number of evaluation approaches. And then we put in a selection of households which is meant or designed specifically to get to this aspect of groups. We surveyed as many members of each self-help group as we could, okay? As opposed to a survey design which picks up one member of the group or two members of the group. And because we had that survey design, we are now in a position to answer a lot of questions about the group. What is it that makes a successful group, and how does group dynamics really come into play? What this presentation, the results that we're going to be talking about, we'll start with summary statistics, and we'll present regression evidence as well, and 3 types of regression evidence. There's going to be the overall result, which is normally what you see in an impact evaluation. What was the overall impact of the program? We're then going to go one step further and say, within that same framework, can we tease out the effect of VOs, the village organization, the federation, and so how does that change the result? And then we're going to go to a third set of results, which is a more structural result, and that is going to say, well, let me look at some group characteristics. Let me look at SAG age, which is what we really identify as the program effect, the duration of membership in SAG, and show how results change with SAG age and what is the effect of VO in that. So you'll see a little bit of all those 3 kinds of results in this. We are focusing on one particular pathway in this presentation. I should say the data is very new. We actually got, through Nielsen, we got some data yesterday. The rest of the data came to us about a month and a half, 2 months ago. And so we are only focusing on a narrow set of results for today's presentation, and that is going to be on self-help group age, and on VO. The basic building block for the analysis is the difference in difference regression that we run. Okay, so everybody knows difference in difference. We're doing it, how do you do difference in a difference with one cross-section of data? That is what we're doing. So I'm going to take a minute just to talk about that, and then go on with it. Okay, so the initial idea for a different diff, and this is what a lot of studies that have used or that have worked within the NRLP and NRLM have done. They have taken the fact that we have early blocks and late blocks. So the late block serves as a control. The early block serves as a treatment. And they've taken early villages in early blocks and compared them to early villages in late blocks. Okay? That is likely to give you very different results from what we get. Why? As an example, okay, so suppose I take Jharkhand. Jharkhand, the early blocks are the tribal blocks. You are supposed to start with the poorer blocks and the blocks that are more disadvantaged. That more tribal blocks have very small villages. You have villages of a population size of 100, 200, 300, etc. Okay? The later blocks are the more advanced blocks. And so then village sizes increase. Okay, so if I take a village size 200 in an early block and compare it to a village size 200 in a late block, those are very different things. The village size of 200 in the early block is surrounded by villages that are 100, 50, 75. The village size that is 200 in the late block is surrounded by villages that are 1,000 or more. Okay? Results are going to differ, which means you have to control for the block effect. How do we control for it? We control for it by comparing it to late villages in early and late and doing a comparison across that. Okay? The difference in difference is therefore this early village in an early block compared to an early village in a late block, and then differencing out the results of the late village. I think this will become, we talked about later, so I'm not going to spend much more in that. The same broad approach identifies the effect of a VO. Okay? So you have an early block from the point of view of a VO development as opposed to an SAG development, and you can use that same diff and diff to simultaneously identify both self-help groups and VOs. It's possible because of this variation in the VO age. So the same block for a SAG, if it was an early block for an SAG, we still see this huge variation in VO age, and that is how we will identify the VO effect. I'm rushing through all this because I've spoken too long already, but I wanted to end up by going back to scale. Okay, so this is the example I gave you earlier. Scale determines the success of the program, and so if you don't control for scale, you may really end up with results that are meaningless or don't really convey it. Okay? This is a sense of how much scale there is in NRLP. Okay, so if you start on the left-hand side, those are the early blocks. Okay, so when you started, there was almost no presence of NRLP. When you come to the end with late blocks, you can see how much that whole program has grown. Okay, and so the late blocks are able to draw on this wealth of experience, expertise, all the CRPs, all the community cadre that has been developed. That will likely have a positive effect. But it could also have a negative effect, and I'll give you an example from ERISA. Okay, if ERISA has been really successful in building up the community cadre, so now there are a large community cadre in ERISA, it means that the number of jobs available for them falls. So the amount of employment they get actually falls over time, and so their incentives to perform are reduced. Okay, so scale can have both a positive effect or a negative effect, but it is going to have an effect. Okay, and so that, I think, is the message that I'll leave you with. At the end of a talk like this, or end of a presentation, you want to go away with some takeaways. And so the takeaway I want to leave you with is if somebody presents the results of a study, you should be asking yourself, what all is bundled in that result? Okay? Does that include the effect of scale? Does it include the effect of every intervention? How do I disentangle that? How do I compare results across studies? And what have I learned from the study? If you're presented with a point estimate, I would suggest that you actually have a lot more to learn. And that is, I think, where we are trying to push on that frontier and make some progress there.
So good afternoon, everyone. I'll move forward and take you through the outcomes and the impact that we find for the household outcomes. So I'll start with an overview of results and also end with them. So we find strong effects of VO federations on loans and financial inclusion. So linking back to what Dr. Kochar previously said, linking it to the econ theory, that federations and scale help in linking them to markets. We find that improvements in income is from sources and majorly from wage income. Analysis of SHG data confirms this household result, suggesting that SHG that still need to transition from institutions that provide financial linkages to more on income and income enhancing institutions. So taking you through the household and individual outcomes. These are just the household sample characteristics. Here I'm presenting analysis from about 25,000 households. We see, as the program was targeted to SC/ST households, we see a large proportion of SC/ST households in our sample too. Just to take you through the summary stats for a few of the outcome variables, we do see that savings in formal institution is more by male members than female members, and a large portion of female savings is done in SHG compared to banks. Taking you through the regression results, we find that the program had a very positive effect on the SHG savings, but not on institutional, and by institutional I mean bank savings. We see about 500 rupees increase in SHG savings in the early village, early block cohort. Yeah. Not putting a lot of numbers here, just telling you how the results look and are they positive, negative, what is enhancing what. So we see that federations help. So the last column, the VOH, defines the VO effect of the effect of VO on the household outcome. So we see that the savings are enhanced by VO. We also see that by itself there is no effect of SHG on formal informal borrowings, but then VOs and the federations have a large positive impact. So a tick with a positive says it's having a positive coefficient, a positive effect, and a negative tick says it's significant but negative. Then we go to few of the household income variables. So by itself, by the results from our model 1 says there's an increase of about 8,000 rupees over the exposure of 2.5 years. But we see that it is improved much more by VO to the tune of about 13,000 additional. We also see that the household income is driven by increase in income in labor market and increase in income in NREGA. The NREGA income does not get affected by VO, saying that probably VOs are not aiding in they're working more on the market side, but not on the social securities and convergence. Moving forward, we see large positive effects on welfare, on house quality, on food diversity, which are further enhanced by VO. Then we also talk about empowerment. Empowerment we have measured by decision making. So by decision making, we have two indices of empowerment. One which is intra-household decision making, asking questions about who makes decision related to food, expenditure on children, and all of that. We see that VOs do have a positive effect on intra-household SHG, intra-household decision making, but does not have an effect on confidence index, which is confidence to interact with other PRI institutions and institutions outside the household. As stated previously also, that we do not find any effect of VO on number of social schemes availed by the household members, stating that VOs work more on the financial aspect, enhance the financial aspects of the household, but not much on convergence and social security schemes. I'll summarize these results again, and they are federating SHGs into VOs led to better financial increase. Federation increases household welfare, and this is reflected in housing quality and food increase in food diversity. NRLP had significant impact on total household income, which is about 8% over the sample mean, driven majorly by wage income. This is further enhanced by federations. Federations empower women in intra-household decision making, but does not impact their confidence to interact outside the household. We will support these household outcomes by taking you also through the SHG outcomes. Bidisha will take you through them.
So what we have seen so far are household outcomes and how the program has, how the program first and how having VOs have impacted household welfare and economic outcomes. We want to be able to say and exploit the beauty of our data, by which we were able to link the households to SHG. And what I'm going to show you now is exactly how were the SHGs performing? What were the parameters? As we had mentioned earlier, we have over 5,000 SHGs. We went and found that around 17%, and these were SHGs that we picked from the MISs, for which I really have to thank our SRLMs. They were such great partners who shared everything with us so easily. We found that 17% were not functioning. The groups were not in existence. But among the functional SAGs, we do find that 84% were probably linked to VOs. But what I'm trying to say is that the basic parameters of what is required of an SAG according to the program were actually met. To my right, you can see some of the reasons why group members said that any member may have left the group, and it is because members don't adhere to norms, or because of certain constraints from their families. So one of the things that we wanted to do was build an SAG quality indices, and across different dimensions. We started off, we are just starting off, like I said, and Anjini says that we're still exploring this rich data. We start by looking at SAG quality through the Panchasutra index. For those who may not be very, and I don't expect there's anyone here there. Panchasutras are really 5 norms that any SAG needs to meet, which are weekly meeting, weekly savings, interloaning, and so on. Action against loan defaulters, and whether books of records are updated. We collected this data. We ranked every SAG on a scale from 0 to 5, with the 5 being the best. And we created a second index, which is the SAG implementation index, whether the SAG has received the kind of support that it should be receiving from the implementation, namely whether it has received the necessary credit and facilities that it ought to have. This is from a range of 0 to 7. Then we looked at what are the activities that the SAG has taken up, and in particular for income generating activities. So this took a value of 0 to 9. As you can see from the graph that I've presented, on average, the Panchasutra adherence is around 3, which is not extremely bad. But when you look at the implementation index, SAGs are not doing very well. And when you look at the income generating activity index, the maximum of which is 9, SAGs are doing even poorly. What you need to take away from this graph is that being a VO member makes a difference to SAG functioning. Overall, it may be low, but being a VO member increases their performance in all 3 in the last 2 indices. We asked SAG members what were the perceived benefits of being members of SAGs, and what do you expect from being an SAG member? The overwhelming focus is again on credit. As you can see from the blue bars, expectations and benefits are really on the financial inclusion side. And this is matched by exactly where SAGs are spending their resources. If you can here, what you have is the amount of savings by SAG members, and what we are able to see is that there is an increase in the amount of savings as an SAG ages. It is higher for those that are members of VOs. If you look at the total loans that have been given to members, that too increases with age, as one would expect, but the increase is higher if you are a VO member. Essentially, all of this ties up to point out that federating SAGs strengthen their performance in households' financial inclusion. These are regressions tables of of our different models on SAG performance outcomes, and these hold up what we saw in the summary statistics. That being part of a VO improves SAG's financial activities. To the last that we have seen, the last column that we have, and perhaps which we did not have a graph for, was what is the role of SAGs in convergence activities. And here we find that VOs that being part of a VO may actually be useful in SAGs taking up convergence activities. But for everything else, for income generating activities, the program has really not focused as much. I would just like to go over repeat the conclusions, and based on our conclusions, try to make a few modest recommendations. We find that NRLM approach of federating SAGs has generated significant returns. Federations led to improvement in financial inclusion and welfare of households. It led to an increase in wage income, and it led to an improvement in women's participation in household decision making. The policy recommendation that we would like to draw from here is to promote and strengthen federations. What we do see is that federations are functioning far from the norms, and yet we are seeing impacts. So if the performance of SAGs can generally be improved through increased adherence to norms, we can expect even better outcomes. And this can be achieved through better monitoring, and such as improving and using the MIS to monitor the program performance. We also noted in all our previous findings that it's the federations that make an impact. And without federations, the impact of SAGs alone would be muted or non-existent. We also note that as SAGs age, their impacts may decline. So the recommendation we would like to make is we need to ensure the capacity of SAGs as they age through better monitoring and incorporating their dynamic requirements. And this is exactly what the point, going back to what Anjini had said, and also which has been held up by our experience in the field, that the changing needs of an older SAGs need to be accounted for. Do they need to go beyond being just credit vehicles of credit? Maybe they want to do something. Aspirations need to be taken into consideration. We see no impact. Our increase in income is coming entirely from wage income, and we see no impact on agricultural and enterprise income. Greater focus needs on income enhancing interventions. Some of that which we would like to recommend is building a community cadre for livelihood support and capacity building of livelihoods institutions, and the role of market could be explored. We see no improvement in women's empowerment outside the household, and we don't see much of an impact in utilization of social schemes. Clearly, a separate set of interventions are needed to promote women's empowerment, particularly when they're interacting outside their homes, and to promote convergence. Thank you. And I just wanted to end with a small thanks to the something that perhaps Anjini might have missed, but I don't want to miss. SRLMs and the 27,000 households, and the SAG DDs who gave us their time and who shared their lives with us for many, many days and for many, many hours. We are most indebted to them. Thank you so much.
Well, I know you have 1,000 questions for us, but I'm going to ask you to write them down, just because I don't want to rob the next presentation of their time. So please do write down your questions, because we do want to have some time for Q&A. But let me quickly rush over to Abhishek and his team to present their findings, and then hopefully some of your questions will be answered with Abhishek's presentation, but otherwise we'll take questions as a set. Over to you, Abhishek.
Thanks, Yamini. We are going to present while sitting. If anybody feels passionately about us going there, just give us a holler and we'll go there. So, this evaluation has had a life of its own. I mean, it was originally actually commissioned around 3 years ago by the Prime Minister's Office and Niti Aayog to see whether NRLM is having an impact at all. And MORD was very generous and kind enough to not do just-in-time evaluation, but do a rigorous one. But we didn't have a baseline, and there were all other issues that Professor Kochar has already touched upon. So, the IRMA, which is one of the premier institutes for rural development, they were brought on board, and we made all the effort that we could to do a rigorous evaluation. You'll probably see the results of it. It got published only recently, but it's just a great effort, and great thanks to MORD for opening themselves up multiple times to do such a rigorous and transparent work. I know in this group I don't need to go through this, but I still quickly 2 or 3 bullet points. This is not something that's new. NRLM is not something that was just started 8 years ago. It's had its histories from 1980s. Various development agencies, NGOs, Sumila today talked about Seva. They've been forming self-help groups in India and in the region broadly. This approach was nationally first time scaled under SGSY, and as Professor Kochar touched upon, it had its issues, and you already know most of those. Then National Rural Livelihoods Mission was set up with the focus on solving some of those issues, especially on institution building and on the livelihoods activities. Although our evaluation cannot separate results on the focus on institution building like Professor Kochar has been able to do, but it's good to see that that focus of the program is giving dividends. Essentially the NRLM's design and approach was largely informed by 2 large-scale programs that were done in Andhra and Bihar, as well as learnings from Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And that's not to discount in any way the other indigenous SHG movements or SHG mobilization that were already there, but this was the genesis of NRLM, so just thought I'll touch upon that. It is, I guess, because I work for the World Bank, it would be important to also mention that what has been the bank's engagement on livelihoods. I think it's one of the oldest existing programs of ours. I mean, in the same league as 20, 30 years of education programs and so on and so forth. So, early 2000s, there were various rural livelihoods programs that were launched in India, broadly in 5 states. And most of them adopted a very intensive approach, which basically meant that more effort was focused on mobilization, on doing hand-holding support, doing capacity building, and then just moving away from just giving out loans and focusing on savings and loans. This model has now reached 59 million women, although this number keeps changing every day. I think Additional Secretary today pointed out 66.3 crores, so that's now 63 million. It's so I had to keep track of it. This model is now being scaled up across India, as you all know. So although this evaluation was commissioned as the intensive model evaluation, which is NRLP, as Professor Kochar also talked about, but as of now, there is no distinction. So in our evaluation, we've now removed that distinction. So we are talking about the NRLM now. I mean, because NRLM is now one model, which is the intensive model. The light model is now getting phased out with the intensive model. So going ahead, you will not see NRLP anymore. You will see NRLM, because I think that we see that as the main program, and that's what we can confidently say we're talking about. Again, I'm not going to get into the details of this, but this is a highly, highly reduced presentation of a 600-page document of what the program does. Essentially, this is the bare minimum model, what it's supposed to do. So it starts with mobilization, getting women into groups and federations, then helping them with savings and using some of that savings to do interloaning, then linking them to banks and with microfinance institutions, and then going ahead, the initial focus of interventions on social empowerment, and then the second tranche of more mature groups and more mature federations have a focus on economic empowerment. Now, the last part, as you'll see, and again, Bidisha touched upon it, and earlier in the session also you heard, that this is an area where the program is still doing more or needs to do more, and this is an area which is probably weak. And when we've looked at producer groups in this evaluation and another evaluation, that component is still getting rolled out at scale. So, so one has to remember, although the initial stages of the program have scaled up rapidly and exponentially, especially in states like Jharkhand, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, where just it's been a machine-like rapid scale up, but the intensity of the various interventions still has been lagging in some of those areas, and obviously that's one of our future focus, future recommendation as well. I already touched about what the evaluation's history was. This just quickly talk about that this, the initial plan was to see whether there were any impacts on female labor force or women working. That's how this was originally thought of. And we also, the government was also keen that we look at what has been the impact on assets, incomes, and other downstream impacts. And as we went on and did the evaluation, we've also got the opportunity to look at some of the distributional effects on some social categories like scheduled caste, scheduled tribes, but also look at impacts of various economic categories. And you know, when this was done, the question in 2016 when this was commissioned, the big question for this was, should the intensive model be scaled up? I think not only this evaluation, but other, you know, field evidence, you know, what the government saw themselves, they eventually agreed that this was the model that the government wants to adopt for the whole program. So I think the last question, although slightly outdated, but it was what it was originally expected to do. I'll pass it on to my other.
Yeah, thanks, Abhishek. Good afternoon to all of you. Thanks for this opportunity. So I will be mostly...
One thing I want to tell you is that we will not have too many technical regressions. Our paper will be available outside. It's available online. We also have these impact notes, which are summary of the results. And we have it for 8 more such evaluations, which the bank has commissioned on rural livelihoods, which over the 2 days you will see. So please feel free to pick them up.
Thank you. So mostly sharing the sampling strategy, the impact evaluation design, what methods we used, and few of the robustness checks and few results. That's what I would be covering in this part. Dr. Kochar and team really articulated that given that there was no RCT as far as the implementation part is concerned, and then whatever baseline data was available across the states, there was a baseline. But that it was so kind of distinct from state to state that coming up with a unified picture of floating another midline survey was almost out of question. So we kind of left with another cross-sectional data collection process that we had to pursue. But then given that this is in 2016 November that we are doing this study, so and this is like couple of 2.5 years of most of the SHG members have been participating in this program. So we were kindly looking at some of the early and short-term impacts, and to hear those kind of impacts is much more difficult to hear it slightly as we go on. So given this observational design and everything, we have to be very careful about how we select the blocks and the villages and the households ultimately. So we went for this multi-stage sampling strategy in which the blocks were identified, the treatment blocks were mostly identified based on how the program uptake rates were at least 50% and more. The potential control blocks came from where the program has just entered or it was about to be floated and scaled up in the coming year. Then the village selection was done using the matching processes where we got access to the socioeconomic caste census, thanks to MORD for allowing to use that database. We could use SECC for even identifying the households when it came to the household selection. Several variables, including ones that were dating prior to NRLM were used, looking at household amenities, village level infrastructural variables that relate to even looking at the educational attainments, the village's access to various kind of resources and so on and so forth were used. And then from there we drew a sample of 727 villages and cutting across to 4,300 plus households, and almost 3/4 of them were from the deprived communities. So that gave us the broad sampling, the sample for the study. As far as the methodology was concerned, since this was a non-experimental study to start with, and given the sample size, what we have to hear, the kind of impacts, we have to doubly sure of what we are looking at can be attributed back to the SHGs and the NRLM. And so we went for a non-experimental design and also for a quasi-experimental design. In the non-experimental setting, we were basically trying to take care of the household's choice-making process of how they decide about participating in the program. And then also about the various biases that creep in because of how the program gets placed inside the villages, and so on and so forth. So the first part, the non-experimental part, looked at basically using certain types of matching algorithms to take care of the observed factors that lead to any kind of such decisions on behalf of the households and program managers. We did the routine balance test, the robustness checks across various kind of algorithms, and we found that the results that we are finding, that we'll share very soon, are holding across these various types of specifications. But then we turn to quasi-experimental methods as well to kind of doubly be assured that what we are finding out is actually holding on. And that's where we started using the institutional and the design effects of the program. The two broad ones that we want to present over here is the Village Level Enterprise Index in 2012. So this was basically one of the basic, the fundamental objectives of the program is to intensify the rollout and opening up and managing and operations of micro enterprises. So we wanted to build upon that and use that to understand whether the pre-existing enterprise intensity in the villages has an effect on, or it is kind of an enabling factor. When a village has a higher enterprise intensity, does it allow the other households or motivate them to pick up the program much faster than the villages where it was the enterprise intensity is on the weaker side? And enterprise intensities are in India are basically driven by the caste and jati propositions in the village, which has been designed or which has been decided like at least a couple of centuries ago. So this was pretty exogenous to what we are doing now as far as NRLM is concerned. So we used that, and then we went for the households, landless households, which was another key aspect of the program, was to look at those kind of households who are landless and try to give them assets which may not have a direct connect with land and generate livelihoods neutral to the land. So we took at these two as instruments for the quasi-experimental part of the study. We'll present these. In addition to the non-experimental and quasi-experimental, we did several robustness checks, try to identify the mechanisms of change, and we did something like the placebo, and we'll just go through that very quickly. So the key indicators of interest, some of the intermediate outcomes that Abhishek was already pointing out is the female working participation rate, female WPR. In fact, that became, given the short run aspect, I mean, that became the key takeaway from the study was the female WPR, household savings, access to loans and cost of borrowings. It sits right in the first month the theory of change, so that's very important outcome to look at. And then we looked at asset ownership, how it has changed, transformed over the last 2.5 years. Rural entrepreneurship, what has happened to the formation of enterprises, who is managing, who is working in these enterprises, and so on and so forth. And then finally, the household income. I'll be presenting the results on the female WPR. This is the time when, secular decline in WPR is happening. I mean, looking at the baseline year, across the treatment and control villages, the WPR, the working participation rates have declined from 49 to 40% actually. Just a very eyeballing of the data showed us that in the treatment villages, the female WPR has declined, but not from 49 to 40, but from 49 to 46 actually. So there is some kind of social security net that is getting triggered. I mean, that was some initial observations we were making based on the descriptive statistics. And when we went further, I mean, we are finding that the program had a positive 7.5% plus effect on the female WPR. Now, when you look at the working participant rates for females, it cannot be seen in soliloquy. I mean, you have to see it across with the fact that how has the household been able to diversify in terms of livelihood generation. And what we're finding is that on an average, NRLM could provide more than one additional livelihood to every household. And then it has got translated into female WPR. And not only that, it's the quality of the livelihood diversification. More high-valued agricultural-based livelihoods have been generated. And then there is very strong evidence to suggest that in addition to the agriculture, even the livestock intensity has gone up in NRLM household, and this is happening in short to medium run actually. So I was already hinting few of the mechanisms through which the female WPR has improved in the short to medium run, and we identified two very major mechanisms. One of them is coming from the livestock ownership. There's sufficient evidence which suggests that even in the absence of being able to transfer assets related to land or more durable assets, it's the livestock which can really push ownership towards female, and that's what is showing up is almost like the income coming from livestock, cash income is 1,300 rupees more in NRLM households. Another route to increased female WPR came from accessing formal credit and how do you use that. So formal credit, I mean the SHG bank linkage-based credit, which went up by 0.77 loans were more procured in NRLM households. At the same time, almost 0.8 of these loans were used less for unproductive purposes. So there was not very strong evidence of the actual purposes for which the loans were used, but then there is a strong evidence suggests that what they were not used for. And if an average household is accessing one loan and you say 0.84 is being used less for unproductive purposes, that's a very significant outcome from the program perspective. As I suggested initially, that given the short-term nature of the study and the observational nature of the study, we had to be doubly sure. So we ran few placebo tests where we were trying to understand that are there some kind of other kind of trends which are there which are influencing the NRLM and non-NRLM households differently. So that was one key thing which bothered us, is that to test whether we can look at some of the competing trends which can influence these two groups separately, and that's why we are looking at these results. And the other part is that how to kind of invoke the placebo type of effects which generally comes from epidemiology literature, where the control group, which believes that it has the treatment, whereas the fact is it doesn't have, and then it responds to that kind of effect. So fortunately we found something very similar in this study. Was the closest to a placebo agent was the spouse of the female, the husband. So when you're sitting inside a household where the wife gets to participate, the husband feels that I'm a part of the program, so I mean that placebo effects get triggered. But then if the programmatic design is basically there to support the women's activity, support the livelihoods generation process for the females, then the male working participation rate should not be influenced differently across non-NRLM and NRLM households. And that's what we found, is that the male WPR did not change in NRLM versus non-NRLM households. So we found that kind of impact over there. We also tested for a few other threats to identification. And just one of that, in the favor of time, I would just share one of these. We're looking at some alternative data generating processes. So what happens is we have these program features which says that okay, women would predominantly be the members of SHGs, would get all the support to enhance their livelihood activities, open up the micro enterprises, get the loans, do what is required to make their livelihoods more sustainable in short to medium and long run even. But then when the same resources get back to the households and the livelihoods get generated, I mean, we don't know what's happening in between. Is it like the livelihoods which got generated, were they gender neutral or were they gendered? So that, I mean, if it is gender neutral, then the livelihoods may get generated, but then there's a sharing happening inside the household. And in that sense, we have to then look at that shared livelihood generation process rather than saying, oh, livelihood generation and female WPR is happening contemporaneously, which may not be happening. So we tested for those possibilities as well, that what if the generation of livelihoods and intra-household bargaining of those livelihoods is happening actually. And we still found that whatever results we are happening in terms of female WPR, the 14% increase in the female WPR still holds when we allow for gender neutral livelihood generations processes happening inside the household. I'll pass on to Shivani.
Just to add one point to the labor force participation rate results. So what we looked at was the working force participation rate and not the labor force participation rate in the course of unavailability of the data. But it becomes, because rural livelihood programs or livelihood programs have not been able to measure labor force participation as a part of their surveys, it becomes very important for recent evaluations in the future to look at measurements of labor force participation, but in the absence of that data, we looked at working force participation ratio. I'm going to be giving some results on the other intermediary outcomes and the final outcomes. So the primary funding mechanism for NRLM is the SHG bank linkage program, or borrowings from community grants. And the program also has a major focus on promoting savings through the group membership platform. So in order to see that, we wanted to look at outcomes related to the borrowings, the savings, the extent of and nature of borrowing, as well as the asset status of the household. And what our results show is that the overall savings by the household has increased by 18.6% in the treatment areas versus the control areas. And this increase is coming mainly from households shifting to formal sources of savings. And then we looked at the extent and nature of borrowing by looking at the current outstanding loans and the cost of borrowing for the loans that they were taking. And what we found out was that there was a 4.9% reduction in the cost of borrowing in the treatment areas as compared to the control areas, which was measured using the annual interest rate for the loans. And we also found out that 24% more households in the treatment areas were having an outstanding loan as compared to the control areas. We also looked at the loan sizes of the current outstanding loan, and our results show that the average, there has been an average increase in the total amount of loan borrowed by almost 2 times. And this result is quite reassuring because NRLP now has facilitated about more than $1 billion since 2011 in terms of lending amount. So the results on borrowing and saving, as Bidisha and Varun have also shown in the recent evaluation, are quite consistent with the previous studies as well. But one thing to note for our study is that the average loan size for the SHG loans was is still very low, and it was only about 12,000 rupees, and the medians were only 10,000 rupees. And which brings me to the results on the asset status of the household, which is contrary from the previous studies, which have shown some impacts on asset status. What our study shows is that there is limited and sobering impact on the productive asset ownership, though we find some impact on livestock asset ownership. We do not find any results on productive asset ownership, which could be because the loan sizes are very small and the households do not have enough money to buy the large productive assets or invest into major land holdings. So what we are trying to show from this particular graph is the source of lending, which is from the banks, and we're trying to show what are the formal source of lending, which are SHG loans and other institutional loans like MFIs and commercial bank loans. And what we see is that overall, the SHG bank linkage program still remains to be the major source of funding for rural areas. And consistent with the other rural livelihood programs, we see that the penetration of other institutional loans from MFIs and commercial banks remains to be very low. But NRLM has made a significant difference and impact by expanding the reach of SHGs and their financial services in the treatment areas. So what we can see is that in the intensive areas, which is seen from the dark blue part of the graphs, the combined reach of MFIs and commercial banks in the survey area still seems to be very low, and it's also less than very less than 3% compared to the NRLM's reach, which can be seen in the second part of the graph, which is the reach of around 35% of the household having SHG loans. Moreover, we also see that in the non-intensive areas, the access to loans, and in particular formal loans, which are from SHGs, MFIs, and bank loans, is still very low, with only 6% of the households having any formal loans. So now coming on to the results for migration, entrepreneurship, and income activities. So one interesting thing to note here is, though Professor Kochar's paper also has results on income sources now, but our study was one of the first studies to look at and collect data for seasonal migration and income by various sources. And in terms of seasonal migration, what our results show is that there's a large and significant increase in the number of nights spent that the household members from the program areas have spent outside their villages. And this was mostly to take up better employment because they were getting better earning opportunities. And we can see the numbers being in the treatment area was about 1,600 rupees versus the control areas of only about 700 rupees. We did look at some few enterprise-related outcomes as well, because that is also the major focus and where we are trying to improve for NRLM program participation outcomes. So we looked at the intensity of enterprises as well as few revenue-related and employment-related outcomes for enterprise related outcomes. And what we found was that there was a small but significant increase in the intensity, and there were more households participating in non-farm businesses. But we did not really find any results on revenue of these enterprises, though we did see that since there has been increased borrowing in the treatment areas now, the households were able to invest around 15% more funds in these enterprises, but these results should be interpreted very cautiously as the sample of these enterprise households is very small. So coming to the results for the household income, we collected data on various sources of income for the households, and we looked at sources like migration, agriculture, livestock, casual wages, salaried wages, income from non-farm enterprises, public and private transfers, and whatever goes on to into the other sources of income. And what we find is for most of the categories of income and total income, we did not see any significant change because of the program participation in the mean of the oversample. However, we did see that the median incomes due to the program participation have gone up, and we also see that several subpopulation, if we look at different quantiles or distributional impacts for these incomes, we witnessed an income increase due to the program participation, and Abhishek will talk more about the distributional impacts when we looked at the quantile regressions.
No, this is just in the interest of time, I'll quickly take you through this. So the idea is to just show that what sections of the participants are seeing impacts. Very interestingly, we find there's a little bit of contradiction in these results. You see that our income on migration and total borrowed in loans are mostly to the bottom 20 percentile. But when you see the income increases, they seem to be more spread, except in the top and the bottom quintile. I mean, more we've looked at this data, more we have essentially realized that the exposure to the program was essentially too less for us to have downstream impacts like large income increases. Probably there are some activities that the beneficiaries took up which had impacts on median income. So, but it's good to see that some downstream impacts are showing in Professor Kochar's results. I think, so overall, this is that the initial focus of the program on skills, borrowing, seems to be working for the bottom 20, and that's, I think, a good thing from a program and a policy point of view.
Just to recapitulate the findings of the study, I think this both the studies have kind of established some very robust evidence that this basic problem of putting women back to the labor force, which is not just in India, but I would say across South Asia, has been one of the major development obstacles, and it appears an NRLM has provided sufficient, it has those kind of programmatic features to provide and put women back into the labor force. The FLFP and the FWPR results are very encouraging in that sense. The primary objective of the savings and the loans, which is part of the theory of change, the second stage right after the first month of enrollment in SHGs, appears to have been met largely, even in the short run of the study that we are looking at. However, the small loan size does not lead to significant effects in terms of the magnitude of the effects, actually. So that's something, one of the major takeaways as far as how to improve the rollout in other places is concerned. What Abhishek was already sharing is, even though the mean incomes, and also Shivani has shared the same, that the mean incomes did not change drastically in as far as the estimation part is concerned, but then the quantile results suggest that the median and results across other quantiles have also picked up. Although this cannot be, we cannot generalize this for the entire sample. Going way forward, I think there's a need, even though we have these two evaluations, but then there's definitely a need to build upon this evidence to not stop here, but kind of look at what kind of long-run effects that an NRLM can generate in times to come. And there are some certain pertinent questions around the role of social networks, the sustainability of SHGs, the profitability of micro-enterprises, and so on and so forth. So some of these questions, at least I can say that for our part of the study has not been answered to the best of our knowledge. The future studies might look at the role of NRLM in promoting rural enterprises. So there is no existing enterprise survey. We do have enterprise level data, enterprise related data in the household modules, but nothing which looks at the enterprise activities in a more micro manner and how they're getting managed, what kind of management practices have been adopted inside these kind of micro enterprises. Given the cross-sectional studies that we have, I think going for a panel kind of a study would really help us to attribute the program effects in a much more better manner. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, let's do a round of applause just to get our circulation back. Those were two pretty long presentations, so thank you for your patience and sort of listening through them. They're so interesting. I have 25 questions of my own. But before opening it up, let me request our two discussants to please first respond, give us some directions to, how to think about these findings, how do you see them, what are the implications for you. So let me call on Ms. Kejriwal to first go for about 5 minutes. I'm sorry, that's maybe too little. And then Gayatri after you.
Thank you, Yamini. So let me start by really thanking all our partners, all who are represented here on the dais, and Nielsen's and my own team who have supported this for doing a really good, doing 2 good evaluation studies. Why we really required this kind of a study is that this is a very, very complex program, and there is a lot of variation between the models that the states are trying to implement. So even though we had some state level studies, etc., there was no really big national level study available. So it was really important that we do this kind of a study. And secondly, NRLM now is moving into a higher level, into the next phase, very consciously moving into the next phase, going into higher level kind of activities. So it is important to know where we are right now. Though we kind of think that we do have a huge coverage, and we think that most of the mobilization work is done, but if you actually look at it, it's only about 60 to 65% of the jobs done. We still have a long way to go. And secondly, because we're going into higher level activities, we needed to know where we stand right now, what are the corrections that we need to make, how do we need to improve our institutions so that they are able to actually handle the responsibilities of higher level activities. So for all these reasons, it was very important to have a very good national level study which would be able to educate us on the further direction that we need to take. And I must say that these studies have really risen up to the occasion, and these NRLM is a very, very complex program, and it tries to address the multiple dimensions of poverty, and therefore doing any study of NRLM is a complex work. And the complexity also comes because we are dealing with so many kind of variations all across the state. So if any study is trying to address this, it has to be not only a quantitative study, but more of a qualitative kind of study. And then the teams also had these constraints of, how do you design the tools or the questionnaires which can collect the maximum amount of relevant information in the minimum amount of time, because we are actually going to sit with the community women to administer all the questions. So the whole exercise of actually developing the tools itself became an exercise in ingenuity. And this was one of the reasons, probably also because of all the delays that happened in the study. So finally, to be able to arrive at a consensus. And then thanks to Nielsen's, they have done a lot of good work in data collection. A huge amount of data has been collected. So despite all these constraints and delays and all, I think eventually we have got a very good study done, and we've got good findings. And the findings are actually able to show us the way in which we need to progress. What are the corrections that we need to. It has pointed out that the basic principles of NRLM are sort of validated, that the process of organizing women and then federating them, that those core principles of working through community resource persons, etc., definitely stand validated. But many things have come up, like with age, in the presentation as pointed out today, with age, the SAGs are not really following the Panch Sutra so much, so we need to be very dynamic in addressing their issues. So these are some of the findings. How do we gear up the village organizations or federations to play a more important role in bringing about more income generating activities, etc., for the SAG women? How do we improve the quality of all our organizations to be able to take up higher level responsibility, etc.? So a lot of very good findings have come from both the studies, which will definitely give us as well as the SRLM's direction, and we will do many more such events to be able to disseminate all the information that is coming. The final report is yet to come, and I expect a lot more information to be coming in the final report, and we are all really looking forward to it. And the last point is that a lot of data has been collected actually in both the studies. Like the IRMA study initially collected a lot of data which was utilized by Abhishek, Vivek and Shivani to have a study on the female labor force participation. Similarly, I think with all the data that we have available, a lot more understanding of this can actually come from that. So a lot of analytics can actually be done on the existing data. So thank you once again. It was, it was, as I would also like to point out in the last session, we talked about how there has to be some balancing or some platform where the imperatives of the evaluating agencies and the requirements of the government converge. And I think in this whole exercise, this kind of convergence has really happened quite a lot. At every point of the study, we have been interacting, and we have been asking the questions, we have been raising our issues, and the team has definitely been responding to that. And I expect the final report will bring out replies to many of the questions that we still have. So great, thank you.
Thank you so much. And let me call on Gayatri now.
Hi. Thank you very much. So I read a quote this morning, and I'm very sorry I can't attribute it because I didn't pay any attention to who actually said it. Obviously a very clever person who said that for every economist there is an equal and opposite economist, and they are both probably wrong. Or I hope in this case they are both probably right. So all that basically to say that I think it's quite amazing the richness of data that has been generated, and as Neeta has said, this is really work that is, in a way just starting, and it will continue for a long time. And of course, I have to say very much a big, big thank you to the Ministry of Rural Development, because I think the openness of the government to doing this sort of evaluation is absolutely critical. And what you've just seen is actually only 2 pieces of such evaluations. There are many, many more going on. And so we are all very excited about what else we can learn from this data as it is analyzed even more. Now, I think it's important, I just want to point out a few things. One is that the aggregate or the overall program effects are important for us to understand, because that's what's driving policy, right? But within these large program effects, there are going to be lots of individual effects or specific programs, specific interventions that are equally important. So it's important for us to just sort of recognize that there are so many moving pieces, And we, each of us, from whichever discipline we're coming from or whatever our specific interest is, also need to pay attention to the data that is generated along those verticals. And you really dive into that and understand what the effects of these interventions are within those verticals and within the states, because there's obviously a huge amount of variation, a huge amount of heterogeneity that needs to be explored much further at the state level as well. So all this is really a big invitation to all of you clever people out there who would like to dive into this data much more and to offer what your perspective would be or what sort of analysis you would want to see being done with this very rich database, which will eventually be disclosed. And a very important point also that Anjini Kochar made, I can't see her, there she is, that the MIS of these kinds of programs, the monitoring data of these programs, is also enormously rich. And it is up to us to exploit it further. I believe Manny noted in the earlier session that when you have good administrative data, it does make your life a lot easier in many ways. So a little bit of discipline is needed to just sort of remember that the MIS and the administrative data part of it is a really good complement to the survey work that has been presented to us just now. A couple of additional points I wanted to make. One is that the results are very encouraging because they do point to factors that are helping to build capabilities at the state level and at the community level. And that's a very long-term agenda, but those indicators are there that capability is being strengthened. The federations that Nita pointed to are obviously playing some kind of an important role in enhancing in helping rural populations reach certain aspirations that they have. We have to do a lot more work to understand, to unbundle it further, to understand how else we strengthen this, whether or not it is more discipline in following the meeting schedules or not. I don't know. Perhaps it is, perhaps it's not. But the point is that something is needed there to keep filling that glass, which is currently half full. But the results, therefore, are also very useful because they point to areas that are not showing the results that we were hoping to see as well. Perhaps this is a problem with the data, perhaps there's a problem with the fact that this is such a complicated instrument that we just have to keep searching for whether or not we are having those effects. But it also requires that we reevaluate a little bit whether we're putting attention in the right spaces. Are we expecting too much from this program across so many different sectors? Certain areas are already becoming very clear, such as if we want to see more effect of investing in enterprise development, in agriculture value added type of activities, then we'll have to put in more effort over there. We'll have to put in more technical expertise. We'll have to be a little bit more, perhaps a little bit more selective as to where we expect those results to show, because not everybody everywhere is going to be an entrepreneur. Not everybody is going to be an excellent farmer. There will have to be exit from agriculture as well. Where will they go? What sort of skills are needed to help them help our rural populations get the kinds of jobs that they aspire to? There's a whole skill building part of NRLM which is not discussed, but is equally important for us to pay a lot of attention to. So for me, these results are really very exciting. They're showing that we have a lot of work to do, but they're also showing that we have a really good platform on which to build on. Labor force participation is an area of very, very great importance for us as a country. And the future strategies of how this program is going to be able to help women and youth enter or re-enter the workforce is, I think, a very important space, and we will be looking to learn more and work with the Ministry of Rural Development on understanding how best to leverage both this program but also other programs, because it's not that the NRLM must do all this on its own, it's how it can leverage other programs and policies that need to be perhaps put into place or strengthened in order to facilitate that sort of effect that we're looking for. So I think that many of the results that we are seeing are consistent with theory, they are consistent with global effects. And we are, that groups do facilitate networking. They reduce search cost. We're seeing an increase of remittance income. This is borne out, this sort of substantiates a lot of the anecdotes that we hear when we go to Bihar, for instance. We hear about didis who are borrowing in order to send their husbands to the Middle East. And then they repay those loans, and they do economic activities as a second sort of phase of their interaction with the loan facilities. But their first, at least all the stories that I've been hearing, is that their first choice is actually to find their job, a job, and we heard from Poonam Devi as well, a job for their husbands, or a job to keep them out of trouble, or get them to start to earn the income that is expected of them as well. And I think that sort of household strategy that the SAGs and the women who are members of the SAGs are adopting is an important one for us to understand. Lots and lots of additional questions have been thrown up. Why is the data not picking up convergence effects? Perhaps this comes as a second phase. It is an important area for the government, certainly, to look to see how best to build those efficiencies across various programs, so quite critical. And as Nita has said, the new investments and the future evaluations will in fact be focusing on some of these understandings that we already have. So improving the way in which we evaluate, perhaps doing more nimble evaluations going forward of some of these specific interventions would be the way to go. And lastly, I would encourage all the academics out there, all the NGOs out there, all the various members of state governments out there to really use this data, to engage much more with the information that we have, so that we are able to ask the right questions. As Preeti was saying earlier, it's super important to ask the right question. Sometimes we ask the wrong question. And we need to be able to look at this from various perspectives. So I invite you all to please engage with all of us and let us move this program further. Thank you.